In this lecture, we'll discuss about the transport of substances across the cell membrane. The cell membrane, as we have already discussed, it is a selectively permeable membrane which will allow certain substances to get into the cell and certain substances to get out of the cell. The plasma membrane, it is this is the outer protective covering of the cell which will allow some of the substances to get into the cell and some of the substances to get out of the cell. The transport of substances is very important for performing various functions of the cell. Some lipid soluble substances such as nitrogen, oxygen, steroids, alcohol, etc., can freely pass through the phospholipid bilayer of the cell membrane. They can freely pass through, but not the case with every solutes or every substance. Some water soluble substances such as glucose, urea, ions, proteins, etc., they may require some carrier protein for their transport across the cell membrane. We'll discuss in detail about this transport. This is the phospholipid bilayer. You can see phospholipid molecules arranged in two layers, and the transport of substances will take place across this membrane. And this phospholipid bilayer forms the cell membrane. So let's see the mechanism of transport of substances across the cell membrane. The basic mechanism for the transport of substances across the cell membrane include two important mechanisms: passive transport mechanism and active transport mechanism. So let's first discuss the passive transport mechanism. The transport of substances takes place along the concentration gradient from a region of higher concentration to a region of lower concentration. The substances will move from a region of higher concentration to a region of lower concentration in passive transport. It does not require energy. Energy is not required. The energy is not utilized for this kind of a transport. And this is known as diffusion. This can be called diffusion or downhill movement. This is movement from a higher concentration to a lower concentration. Downhill movement. The types of diffusion, types of passive transport. It includes two important types of passive transport, which include simple diffusion and facilitated diffusion. Let's see simple diffusion. Simple diffusion occurs across the cell membrane through the phospholipid bilayer. Okay. Lipid soluble substances such as carbon dioxide, oxygen, alcohol can freely pass through the phospholipid bilayer, and it also occurs through carrier this protein channels present in the cell membrane. You can see that this is a protein channel, so that the substances can pass through the protein channel from one side of the cell to the other side of the cell across the cell membrane. This is the cell membrane made of phospholipid bilayer. It passes through the phospholipid bilayer. It may also pass through the protein channels from one side of the cell to the other side. Okay, that is simple diffusion. Here, or further, the water soluble substances such as electrolytes are also transported across the cell membrane in this kind of simple diffusion. So we have already discussed some lipid soluble substances, carbon dioxide, oxygen, alcohol. They freely pass through the phospholipid bilayer of the cell membrane, and it can also occur through the protein channels present in the cell membrane. We have seen in the diagram too. And water soluble substances such as electrolytes are also being transported across the cell membrane through simple diffusion. The next is facilitated diffusion. Facilitated diffusion is faster than the simple diffusion. Here, carrier proteins are helping in the transport of substances in this type of diffusion. Carrier proteins. So here you can see carrier protein. Here, in simple diffusion, we have seen that there are protein channels involved in the transport of substances across the cell membrane. Here, carrier proteins are involved in the transport of substances which will carry a molecule from one side of the cell and which transport to the other side of the cell. Okay, right. So the water soluble substances, which are larger molecules that could not pass through the protein channels, which could not be transported through protein channels by simple diffusion, will be transported with the help of carrier proteins. The carrier protein will transport larger molecules from one side of the cell to the other side across the cell membrane. So here amino acids and glucose are being transported through such type of diffusion, facilitated diffusion. See the diagram, this shows diffusion from where from a region of larger concentration, higher concentration, it is transported through the cell membrane, across the cell membrane, across the phospholipid bilayer to a region of lower concentration. So here you can see there is carrier protein involved in the transport of substances from a region of higher concentration to a region of lower concentration. Here you can see there is involvement of a protein channel which helps in the transport of substances from a higher concentration to a region of lower concentration. Okay, right. Next is active transport. In active transport, the movement of substances occurs against the concentration gradient. Here, substances will be transported from a lower concentration to a region of higher concentration. It is called uphill transport because it is being transported against the concentration gradient. For that to happen, it requires a carrier protein. It requires a carrier protein for the transport of substances across the cell membrane here. The active transport also require energy, and the energy is obtained by the breakdown of ATP. So energy is required in this kind of active transport. In passive transport, there was no requirement of energy. So here the substances like potassium, sodium, calcium, chloride, hydrogen, iodide, amino acids, glucose, urea, etc. are transported across the cell membrane through active transport. All these substances are being transported through active transport. Here you can see that here is the carrier protein which transports substances, solutes from a lower concentration to a region of higher concentration where there was already a higher concentration molecules, and with the use of ATP, with the use of energy. Energy is also being utilized. So this is the outside of the cell. From the outside of the cell, the substances are being brought to inside of the cell through the carrier proteins with the use of energy. The types of active transport we'll discuss. There are two types, primary active transport and secondary active transport. So in primary active transport, energy is required for the transport of substances, and the energy is derived directly from ATP. And the examples include sodium potassium pump, calcium pump, hydrogen potassium pump, sodium hydrogen pump. All these it utilize energy directly from ATP. And the secondary active transport, here energy is required. The indirect involvement of energy is there. So there is energy indirectly utilized in the transport of substances. In many tissues, sodium ions are transported along with other substances. So one substance is being transported along with another substance. For example, glucose, amino acids, etc. You can see that here. So there is a carrier protein involved. Okay, there are two different substances which are being transported to the other side of the cell. Okay, so in that both solutes may bind to a common carrier protein. It will bind to a common carrier protein on one side of the cell membrane and is transported together. It is transported together to the other side of the cell membrane. Here you can see that in the middle, this diagram. here two different molecules. They are transported together from one side of the cell to the other side across the cell membrane. And sometimes this carrier protein may transport one substance in one direction, the other substance in the opposite direction. You can see that in the diagram here. This one antiport. Here this is an example for symport. Here the substance is transported in the same direction. Two substances are being transported in the same direction. So in antiport, one substance is transported in one direction and the other is transported in the opposite direction. So this kind of transport is also possible. So this was all about the transport of substances across the cell membrane. In that we have discussed about the different types or different mechanisms of transport of substances, in which we discussed about the active transport and passive transport. In passive transport we discussed about simple diffusion and facilitated diffusion, and in the case of active transport we discussed about the primary active transport and secondary active transport. Thanks for watching, and please do subscribe, like and share. Thank you.